and I'm a family practice doctor and a functional medicine doctor in Lexington, Virginia. And my biggest interest is in preventing Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. About 6 years ago, I did the 23andMe test, and I learned that I have 2 copies of the really bad gene for Alzheimer's. And at the time that I learned it, I was already a functional medicine doctor, and I was already aware of a lot of things that you could do. But I've sort of made it my mission since then to learn everything that I can about the underlying genetics and mostly lifestyle things that can be done to slow and completely prevent cognitive decline. And I think it's absolutely possible. My belief is that the thing that will ultimately work is it's going to have nothing to do with pharmaceutical. It's going to be a prevention rather than a treatment, because by the time somebody has Alzheimer's disease, there's so much damage, and going in at that point and reversing things is much less likely than preventing them from happening in the first place. Alzheimer's disease itself is sort of an umbrella term that refers to late stages of cognitive decline, when people are really no longer able to function because their brains aren't working well. And when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, there's some specific things that build up in the brain, plaques and fibers that change in the brains of people who died with dementia in the late 1800s and were dissected. That's how Alzheimer's got its name. Alzheimer's affects about 6 million people in this country, and that number is expected to rise as the baby boomers go through. And we know that Alzheimer's is a result of genetics, but also diet and lifestyle and environment. And I want to talk about the processes that we know underlie the disease of Alzheimer's, and the things that we think trigger cognitive decline, and also what we can do to prevent it and to recover from it. So the brain is this amazing web of neurons, these cells, brain cells, and the connections between the neurons. And memory, we used to think memory resided in the neurons, but now we understand that memory resides in the sort of symphony of sound that happens as those neurons fire together. So it's more of an electrical signal and a collective electrical signal that is what creates memory. So as we learn, small structural changes take place in the connections between the neurons. So like when you learn to play tennis, the neurons that govern your hand-eye coordination and the movement of your body and even your confidence, they all start wiring together, so you get better and better at things that you do more. Our bodies carefully protect our neurons using the immune system and hormones and energy and vitamins from our food. It's kind of like a garden. The inputs in a garden are water and sun and nutrients and clean air and oxygen. And in great conditions, our gardens aren't going to get wiped out by a virus or a fungus. But if the support systems get weakened by soil that doesn't have the needed nutrients or an overly stressful environment, then our garden won't flourish. And the analogy is pretty good also when we're talking about our brains. In cognitive decline, some threat is sensed by the brain. Something is amiss, or the brain doesn't have enough of what it needs to thrive. And in response, the brain chooses to destroy certain neurons. And they don't just die, they self-destruct. And you kind of have to wonder, why would the brain do this? Why would it destroy itself? And the reason is that the brain controls everything, not just your memories, but your heartbeat and your breathing and your sleep and your digestion and your emotions, everything. So in order to keep the neurons that are critical for life, for you to stay alive and remember to breathe, it sacrifices the neurons that you don't need to survive, like how to get to Charlottesville and back, or your daughter's name at the end of your life. So in the 1800s, Alzheimer dissected the brains of a bunch of people who had died with dementia. And what he found was these very definite changes that he could see under the microscope, these tangles of neurons that contained something called amyloid. And so his assumption, which made total sense, was that there was something wrong that was causing the amyloid to form. So we now know that the formation of amyloid beta is the exact response that the brain should be having in certain contexts. When the brain senses threats, it produces more beta amyloid, more amyloid beta. And the problem is that we evolved to deal with different threats than the ones that we're dealing with now. And so beta amyloid production runs rampant and runs unchecked, and that's what's leading to nerve degeneration. So I'm going to go through this in some detail because it's really important, and this is really the only part of this talk that's kind of going to be complicated the next couple of minutes. So the underlying process that you need to understand a little bit about is inflammation. And inflammation is a normal response in the body. It's what you get when you sprain your ankle or you get a cold. It turns on and then it turns off. And the turning on and off of the inflammatory response is something we do millions of times a day. And the problem is that when the immune system is constantly turned on and doesn't resolve the inflammatory response, that we get chronic inflammatory problems, and chronic inflammation can produce amyloid beta. And chronic inflammation can come from a lot of things. It can come from untreated infections. It can come from a poor diet, from exposure to chemicals, from toxic molds. It can come from smoking. And chronic inflammation and the things that follow from that are at the root of probably most brain diseases, including Alzheimer's, also mental illness, also ALS, also depression, also bipolar disease, also Parkinson's disease. So it's not just that Alzheimer's is one of the problems of the modern age. The human immune system has two distinct parts that actually evolved separately from one another. They usually cooperate nicely with one another to kill foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses and funguses, and then heal the damage that's caused by the war that our body wages against those things. The first responder part of the immune system is the innate immune system. It's called the innate immune system because we're born with it and it doesn't really change, it doesn't adapt. It's really the part of the immune system that first encounters foreigners. And it's sort of just this roving band of white blood cells that go through the goo that is our body. And when it encounters something that's not us, it slurps it up and starts spewing out molecules of alarm. Kind of like you would dump bleach off the castle wall. Nothing really sophisticated, and a lot of toxic substances are released by the innate immune system. The innate immune system isn't picky. It reacts to everything that it thinks is not self. But it's particularly reactive to things that are from life forms, so bugs, because its real job is to protect us from dying of a parasite or a bacteria or a virus. And it creates a response that's really familiar to you. You get tired and achy and stupid and maybe red and swollen membranes. That's the response generated by the innate immune system. First few days of any infection is mostly driven, the symptoms that you get are mostly driven by the innate immune system. Then the innate immune system, in addition to spewing out these molecules of inflammation that both kill anything in the environment and call in help in case there's a bigger problem that needs a bigger arsenal to work with, the immune system then chews up whatever it finds to be not self and presents it to the other part of the immune system that's called the acquired immune system. And the acquired immune system is called that because it acquires knowledge from what you're exposed to. So you have the capacity to make antibodies to inactivate any number of things because you've got all the puzzle pieces that you would put together to inactivate a strep bug or a Lyme bug. But until you've seen it, you're not doing that. And so your acquired immune system learns from the information that it gets from the innate immune system. But the antibodies that are formed by the acquired immune system are a little toxic. So they're almost never present in the brain. There's too much toxicity there. So the brain is much more reliant on the work of the innate immune system to protect you. Historically, scientists understood the acquired immune system and the antibodies that it made a lot earlier, and assumed that the innate immune system, which we share with bacteria, was unimportant because after all, we share it with bacteria. How could it be that important? And also because they couldn't study it as early. So it didn't kind of get into the way that modern medicine made the rules about what we think about. So for a long time, we've assumed that the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease are making that beta amyloid by mistake, and that it's incorrectly there doing damage because the body's doing it wrong. Now, more and more research ties autoimmunity and neurodegeneration and mental illness to the innate immune system. Now that we can study it, it turns out that when you study those molecules from the innate immune system, they're quite high in all these problems. So, amyloid beta is part of the innate immune system, and it's intimately involved in the causes of Alzheimer's disease. And clearly it does tremendous damage. But what purpose does it serve? Why is it there in the first place? It turns out beta amyloid is an antibiotic. It's a potent, natural antibiotic. So your body spews out amyloid beta when it senses a threat from a life form. That much we know to be true. We don't know everything about it, but that much has been figured out. There's some clever new research that's coming out of Harvard, Dr. Tanzi's lab, that revealed that the plaques that surround the neurons are often surrounding an invader, sometimes Lyme disease. They find viruses, fungi have been found in there, bacteria have been found in there that have somehow traveled into the brain. We used to think the brain was sterile and that nothing got into the brain, and that there was no lymph system in the brain, and there was this blood-brain barrier that kept everything out of the brain. And in the past decade, all that understanding has been sort of shot to the moon because it's just not the way it is. So what happens is these pathogens, these bacteria and viruses and fungi that get into the brain could seriously damage it if they were allowed to keep being in there and growing. So the body spews out amyloid beta to kill them. The neurons themselves make amyloid beta to kill the pathogens, and the neurons are just damaged in the crossfire. They're collateral damage. They're not doing it on purpose. So amyloid beta is made by the body from a precursor protein. So there's a protein that is amazingly named the amyloid precursor protein. And it sits on the surface of the neurons. It sits on the surface of all the neurons. And it samples the environment. And when the environment is favorable, there's a second molecule called Netrin-1 that binds to the receptor and stabilizes it. My understanding, and I think the general understanding of this, came from a brilliant neurologist at UCLA named Dale Bredesen, who's done a lot of research in the field of Alzheimer's and also works with the Functional Medicine Institute to educate doctors about ways to prevent Alzheimer's. When Netrin-1 is present and bound to the amyloid precursor protein, the amyloid precursor protein cannot split. It will not divide. But when Netrin-1 leaves or is not available, then the amyloid precursor protein will divide. And it will divide in one of two ways. It will either divide into two pieces that support and maintain the neuron, so both of which are like fertilizer for the brain, or it will divide into four pieces, each one of which gives a different message for the brain to self-destruct. And one of those is amyloid beta. And when amyloid beta is present, it can also signal to nearby neurons that there's trouble and cause the Netrin-1 to come off of that one. So it behaves like a prion. So in this way, when the neurons are not being adequately nourished, amyloid beta will beget more amyloid beta in a vicious cycle. And as more and more amyloid beta molecules are produced and build up, they stick to one another and eventually form the plaques that can engulf entire neurons and seriously endanger the entire brain and ultimately lead to death. So this process of amyloid beta formation occurs over years and years, and it's before any symptoms exist. It has been occurring for at least a decade, it's thought. What we know is that if bacteria or viruses get into the brain, they can start this process. But even if it starts, if everything else is good, it's not necessarily going to be a problem. It's just concerning. Chronic inflammation that doesn't resolve itself quickly is the problem. And and the innate immune system is the part of the immune system that's most concerningly involved in Alzheimer's disease. The innate immune system, as I said before, responds to biological toxins. Some people call them biotoxins that come from viruses and funguses and bacteria and parasites and their metabolic byproducts. Not just the full organisms, but fragments of these things can cause problems. So when our innate immune system cells find these biotoxins, they react with an extreme inflammatory response. When your load of biotoxins gets too heavy, you have a high risk of developing chronic inflammation that's going to create problems in your brain. You also run the risk that some of those biotoxins, even if the problem is originally not in your brain, that some of the biotoxic byproducts of it will get into your brain and create this inflammatory response and set off the innate immune system's alarm bells and the beta amyloid production that will start isolating the neurons. So there are three main categories of biotoxins, and we're going to talk about them next. First one is Lyme disease and other stealth infections who don't make their living by having you sneeze them or create diarrhea that makes you spread them that way. The way these guys make their living is to get in your body, stay there beneath the radar of your immune system so that you don't quite wipe them out. Syphilis is a great example. Pretty much all the sort of smoldering STDs are great examples of things that are able to stay in your system until they can get into another body. In the case of Lyme disease, those bugs want to get low in your immune system so that you don't notice them long enough for you to get another tick bite, and then they'll rush into the next tick. That's how they get around. That's what they do, and they do it brilliantly, and they've been doing it for millennia. As long as there's infection there that your immune system is seeing, your amyloid beta is spewing out these molecules of inflammation, it's important, and it's understood to be important, I think in the scientific community now, to treat any underlying infections with viruses or any syphilis, Lyme, tuberculosis is going to increase the amount of risk for developing dementia. This is an extreme example of something that even at low levels can be extremely toxic to some people. Mold and the byproducts of mold are toxic to the brain. Mold is a weaponizable biotoxin. Mold products have been found and funguses have been found within amyloid beta plaques. And I'm not talking about cheese mold or the molds that are outdoors. We're talking about the monocultures that exist in modern, inadequately ventilated buildings. Because think about a compost pile. It's full of mold. And think about caves. People used to live in caves, and there was mold in caves. But there's some things that have changed. In the case of a compost pile, there's not just mold. There's mold and bacteria, and they're competing. And so there's not one huge amount of one biotoxin. Sure, if you slept on a compost pile every night, it might give you problems. But it's not going to give you the same kind of problems that sleeping in a monoculture indoors will, because there's better ventilation, that you're not so exposed to a single thing whose job is really to break down material, right? The other thing that's different in a modern world that makes molds in buildings more concerning and more prevalent is that we're now using fungicides on our crops, and because we're wiping out all the easy to kill fungi, not all of them, but a lot of them, we're generating more and more toxic, virulent molds that are really good at growing and sending out toxins into the world to protect themselves. That's what the toxins are for, and to degrade the environment. Molds feed on paper, so sheetrock is a big problem. But until we came inside and started ventilating and basically hermetically sealing our houses, I don't think mold was a problem for our ancestors like it is for us. And I think, therefore, it's a problem that modern medicine is kind of modern medicine is kind of not yet reckoning with how big a problem mold can be for some people. And the thing that I think is most important to know when you think about mold is that the problem isn't cleanliness. The problem is humidity plus some kind of substrate for the mold to grow on. It can be paper, it can be sheetrock. Sure, mold will grow on concrete, but not as rapidly and as happily as it will eat up sheetrock. So modern houses are also made out of much more porous materials than older houses were, that are much easier for the mold to get in. And mold is also commonly found in air conditioners in toxic amounts. So modern buildings become a health hazard for some people. And there's also the problem that there's genetics involved. Not everybody is equally susceptible to mold. Some people's innate immune system is super good at communicating the problem of mold to the acquired immune system so that antibodies are rapidly made that inactivate the mold, and the mold gets removed from the body before it does damage. But about a quarter of people have a sluggish, the part of the immune system that communicates between the innate immune system and the acquired immune system, the handoff machinery, which is the HLA part of the immune system, is a little bit sluggish in some people about handling mold and Lyme toxins specifically. And those are the people who, when they are exposed, get super sick. And because everybody doesn't get super sick, it's assumed that their super sickness is psychosomatic or psychiatric. As far as I understand the information that we have now, one of the most important things you can do is, if you are in a moldy place, workplace, or living space, figure out how to get it dry and how to get the mold out. And the one thing that I think is important to understand about mold that I haven't said is that it's very difficult and very expensive to get a house mold free, but there's a lot of industry building up around helping people who understand that they have some symptoms that might be coming from mold. Some of those companies come in and do air tests in the middle of the room. The mold is not in the middle of the room. The mold is behind the walls or in the basement, and the spores don't travel far, and only the spores are going to grow on that growth medium, but the spores aren't the only byproduct of the mold that's dangerous. And so the air samples aren't the best way to test for mold. And I think that's just important to understand. And the other thing that's kind of connected to that, there are companies that will come along and spray the mold to kill it and inactivate it. But just like you can take a vaccine that's made out of something that's dead and your immune system will still react and form antibodies, your immune system still struggles with and tries to resolve mold toxins and mold byproducts, even if they're dead. So dead mold isn't safer for you than live mold. It's a huge problem and a huge expense, and I wish I had a solution for that, but the solution isn't to spray chemicals, even clean green chemicals, unfortunately. So the third biological force that creates risk for Alzheimer's disease is viruses. We know that the herpes 6 and 7 viruses are often found in the amyloid beta plaques that Alzheimer's disease victims have. And recent studies have been done that have shown that people who have herpes and take medicines to treat the herpes and to keep it from recurring have a tenth the rate of Alzheimer's disease as people who don't. That study was done in Thailand. It needs to be repeated, but it seems that just keeping your viral load down, which makes sense because then your immune system isn't having to try to do that by spewing out all the chemicals, but just keeping the viral load down seems to be an important thing that you can do if you have recurrent viral infections. In terms of viruses, the kind of viruses that we're most worried about when we think about Alzheimer's are the ones that stay in the body, like the herpes viruses, the ones that are sexually transmitted, much more so than the cold virus, because it just comes in kills a bunch of cells and leaves, because its way of making a living is to get us to spew it rather than to get us to harbor it. The other thing that's connected to the risk for Alzheimer's and bacterial, actually all the infections, is the importance of dental health, because there's so many bacteria and viruses in our mouth, and the neurons in our mouth wire very directly into the brain. And so keeping, you're not having sinus infections and having, flossing your teeth every day are very, very important parts of lowering your risk for cognitive decline.